Good evening and welcome to Tracking the Tropics. I'm CBS 17 Storm Team Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein in Raleigh, North Carolina. Marco is gone, but we continue to track Hurricane Laura, which became that hurricane earlier today in the Gulf of Mexico, but it could be a major hurricane by the time it makes landfall tomorrow night or early Thursday morning, somewhere in Louisiana or Texas. If that happens, this would be the 7th tropical system to make landfall in the continental United States this season alone. Tonight, we'll go live to Louisiana and then to the Florida Panhandle to break down everything you need to know about Laura. But first, let's get to the very latest from the National Hurricane Center. We get intermediate updates at 8 o'clock Eastern. We just got it, and the storm continues to get stronger. Remember, when we all got up this morning, it was a tropical storm. Winds were 60, 65 miles per hour. And tonight, the 8 o'clock update has winds now up to 85 miles per hour. Still a Category 1 hurricane with gusts up to 100 miles per hour. The pressure also continues to drop. So pressure, when that goes down, usually everything else goes up, the winds and the gusts. It is moving west-northwest at 17 miles per hour. Ignore all those statistics for a second and let's just look at the satellite of this storm throughout the day today. It's starting to get better organized. You can see it looks a little more like a tropical system. It's more symmetrical. We're starting to see that counterclockwise swirl. It looks more round. It looks absolutely nothing like Marco, which was a disaster of a tropical system in the scientific and meteorological sense. It wasn't put together very well. Unfortunately, this one is. It has a lot of warm water where it can continue to strengthen over the course of the next couple of days. I want to show you the visible satellite, which is basically just like taking a camera up into space. It only works during the daylight hours, but it does such a great job of showing us every little thing going on, from all the little clouds in the outer bands to some of the thunderstorms that develop around what is appearing to be an eye forming around the center of Hurricane Laura. But you can also see this kind of thin little donut-shaped hole at times today. That is what is most likely the start of what is going to be a well-defined eye by the time this is heading for Louisiana and Texas sometime Wednesday night into Thursday morning. Interesting sight with the hurricane hunters. If you were with us last night, we had 3 planes out there at one time. Tonight we have 2, and I know it looks like a jumbled mess of zigzaggedy lines, but they're very important. 2 different flights tonight. One, the plane that's still out there flying directly through the center, continuing to get information on the current conditions. That's one of the reasons we know winds are up to 85 miles per hour at 8 o'clock. The second plane, which was flying all the way out here in the western Gulf of Mexico and is just returning home to Florida, they were sampling the atmosphere in the upper levels. Going to gather all that information, feed it into the hands of meteorologists and computer models all over the world, because this is where the storm is going. So if we have a better idea of what's going on where the storm is headed, we can have a better idea of what the exact forecast is going to be. So there are men and women who fly the U.S. Air Force and the people, the scientists in back, do an amazing job, and they do some great information gathering that really helps us in deciding where the storm is going and, more importantly, how bad it's going to be. So speaking of what's going on right now, here is a live look at either land-based or ocean-based sensors. And what we're looking at right now is winds. The eye of the storm, the center of Hurricane Laura here at the bottom, that's about 300-400 miles south of the coast of Louisiana. And while we've got wind gusts right now that are 20 to 30 miles per hour, that's not significant. That could be an average day depending on where you are on the Gulf Coast. But what we're going to be watching over the course of the next 24 hours as the strongest part of the storm starts to pass over some of these buoys, we're going to be looking really closely at how strong these winds are going to be. And unfortunately, they are going to get stronger. Before we get to our first guest, I want to show you the forecast track from the National Hurricane Center. Remember, the 8 o'clock update we got from the National Hurricane Center was basically just a position and current condition update. The forecast track was updated at 5 p.m. Eastern and again tonight at 11 p.m. Eastern. So this is now a few hours old, but the message has not changed. A major hurricane could be headed for the Texas and Louisiana coast. Could be a Category 2 hurricane by either later tonight or early Wednesday morning, continuing to strengthen, become a Category 3 hurricane sometime late Wednesday night or early Thursday morning as it makes landfall either in southeast Texas or southwest Louisiana. The impacts will spread in both states. Then it will weaken and strangely get picked up by a cold front in the upper atmosphere and make a right turn and probably dump a couple inches of rain on somebody in the mid-Atlantic or the Northeast. So scattered showers this weekend for the East Coast, but a massive major hurricane headed for Texas and Louisiana. Look at how many watches and warnings are out. Most of the state of Louisiana is under some type of hurricane or tropical storm watch or warning. Everyone in red here from really Houston all the way over to Lafayette and all the way up north to Alexandria, Louisiana, under a hurricane warning. That's everything in red, and everything in orange, kind of one step below that, a tropical storm force warning. These warnings mean that either tropical storm or hurricane conditions are expected in that area. So it's going to be a long 48 hours for our friends in Texas and Louisiana. Let's bring in our first guest tonight here on Tracking the Tropics. From WMBB in Panama City, Florida, Chief Meteorologist Ross Whitley. Ross, you have talked to us a few times over the years. Before we jump into Laura, you guys had your hands full and a rough go of it with Tropical Storm Marco yesterday. I don't think a lot of people realize how bad it was in the Panhandle of Florida.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's one of those surprises that happen with tropical system. Is we always say, don't pay attention to the cone. Effects happen well outside of the cone. Well, we were a prime example of that, and definitely a case study for it over the coming years, because most of what the convection around the center of Marco got sheared off by a trough that was situated over the Gulf of Mexico. So that pushed all of the moisture in our area, and that brought us not only rain, but also tornado warnings yesterday. We had several tornado warnings across the area, and we had several flash flood warnings, and even locations right along the beach had 6 to 8 inches of rain in a matter of a few hours. And that was no fun for any residents along the beach yesterday. So it was not much fun. And even though Marco center was 200-something miles away, we had to deal with really the worst of Marco thanks to that wind shear bringing us all of the moisture.
Yeah, Ross, let's talk a little bit more about the wind shear, because the wind shear tore apart Marco, and people are wondering, well, how come it's not going to do the same to Laura? Meteorologist Brian Hutton Jr. actually broke that down for us. Let's look at that, and then we'll talk on the backside.
Well, Marco met its demise simply because of wind shear, which is a change in wind speed and direction with height. Now, we have to remember that the atmosphere is 3 dimensions, and so because of that, the center of circulation will feel wind at all levels. And for Marco, there were strong winds from the southwest in the middle portion of the atmosphere and the winds from the southeast at the surface. And what this did was actually separate the center of circulation so that the mid-level part, that moved towards Alabama to the north and east, and the surface part, well, that went west-northwest towards Louisiana, and actually made a landfall. For Laura, though, this will be different. High pressure will set up over top, which is actually the favorable environment for a hurricane to strengthen. So shear won't impact Laura, unfortunately. For CBS 17 News, I'm meteorologist Brian Hutton Jr.
Okay, Ross, so unfortunately, we're not going to get, 2 for the price of 1 here with this upper level wind shear and Laura. Let me get your thoughts on Laura. You know, it looks like it could be a monster Cat 3. A lot of people are comparing it to Rita. It's headed for the place that Rita hit a few years ago. It's got a lot of warm water out in the Gulf of Mexico. Tell me what you're seeing as Laura heads to the northwest.
Yeah, I actually think the appropriate comparison, I know Rita is relatively close as far as landfall, but Ike and Katrina actually, I think, are better in comparison as far as storms go. I know Katrina came from southwest Florida and was moving in a different direction, but Katrina was a broad system, had a broad core and a very large eye. Even though it was able to get down to such a low pressure, it was a broad system, and Laura is definitely a broad system. And those broad systems, they do 2 things. They bring effects to a very large area. They also allow for a massive amount of water to be moved. And that's one of those things that we just don't talk about, because New Orleans kind of stole the headlines with Katrina, was the water that it pushed inland into Mississippi. You had a record breaker actually for the Gulf Coast was a 26-foot storm surge in parts of Mississippi. So Laura, in my opinion, that's where the biggest issue comes from with this system. As of now, even though it doesn't have a well-defined eye just yet, if you broadly sketch around where that center is, it's an eye wall from about 24, 25, maybe even 26 miles wide. So this is a very, very large core. And even if it tightens up, it's still got that broad circulation and rotation around the center of the storm. So that's going to push a lot of water. Ike obviously made landfall in Galveston Bay. That pushed in 17 feet of water in areas in Galveston Bay. And obviously had storm surge in similar areas that this one is going to do that. So I think that those two are better comparisons than Rita as far as the actual storm goes.
Interesting that you bring up Ike. Someone reminded me this earlier today. In 2008, when Ike hit Texas, it was only a Category 2. And it devastated that area. This could be a Category 3. And in a kind of a roundabout full circle, you know, we had Isaias this year. Ike was in 2008. It got retired after that. Isaias got inserted into Ike's spot. We didn't know about it 6 years ago, but we all know about Isaias this year. So that's kind of a first full circle. Ross, I got the storm surge forecast up here behind me, and it could be as bad as 9 to 14 feet in parts of Louisiana. You said excess of 20 feet, talking about Ike and some of the more devastating storms. Remind everyone, you know, what storm surge is and why it's so bad for people who live on the coast and why they have to evacuate.
Yeah, so we think of two things when we talk about storm surge. We talk about the water rise, so the level of the water shelf itself, and then we talk about inundation. So that's how far the water table is going to make it inland. And in this case with Laura, the projection right now is 9 to 13 feet. Now, the problem with 9 to 13 feet in some areas, or 9 to 11 feet, I should say, is that we're talking about an area of the country that has a very, very shallow Gulf shelf. So Louisiana has a whole lot of shallow water just offshore, and that gets pushed inland relatively easily. So wind will push that water inland. And what we're not accounting for when we talk about storm surge is waves. So you're going to have waves of water pushing inland on top of the fact that you're also going to have the water table rise over the land. So that's the two big issues with storm surge, and that's why it can be so devastating, is because from 1 minute to the next, you can see water rise a few feet very, very quickly. And what often happens is that people that live in these areas and kind of forget, because we're human, we have poor memories about previous storms and how quickly water came in, is most people say, well, you know what, when I need to leave, I will leave. I'm going to wait until that point in time. Well, the reason your local governments issue mandatory evacuations is because they're saying there's going to be a point in time when A, they can't help you, and B, you're not going to be able to leave. So they're telling you to leave now. That's why you should heed those warnings, because you A, won't get help, and B, might be stuck when that water does rise. For my recent memory was Michael a couple of years ago. Places even on Mexico Beach did not see storm surge until the eye was just about making landfall. So even with Mexico Beach, the water came in all at once. And some individuals there have recently told me since that storm that they were just in awe with how quickly the water came in. They were thinking it would be this slow process, but in fact, it was a matter of minutes that they went from basically no water there to 5, 6, even 10 feet in places of water to what really seemed like a few minutes.
Yeah, Ross, excellent point. That's why we always say run from the water, evacuate from the coast where the storm surge is, and hide from the wind. If you're inland, you always shelter in place. Ross Whitley, good stuff in Panama City. We'll talk to you down the road. And Ross's neighbor just to the west in New Orleans, Scott Pellier, is now joining us from WGNO. And Scott, I'll bring you in and kind of ask, like I talked to Ross about, kind of tell us what you guys saw with Marco. I think you had it better than they had it in the Florida Panhandle in New Orleans with Marco. Is that right, Scott?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. With Marco, I mean, we were kind of the optimal solution, right? We wish every single storm would do exactly what Marco did, you know, just kind of poof, right? It just completely fizzled and really not a whole lot. I'll tell you what, we actually had some of the most incredible rainbows with some of those tropical showers that passed across the region. And if that could be, the outcome with every single one of these tropical systems, yeah, Marco kind of fizzled. We actually had, the official landfall of Marco right in Plaquemines Parish. But I tell you what, mini Marco is what we were kind of at the station talking about. The fact that that was a tropical storm at landfall, of course, classification matters, but it was not a whole lot. We saw coastal flooding and, choppy seas inside of Lake Pontchartrain and Lake Maurepas, about a foot or two above normal, but it was nothing significant here.
All right, good to hear. Unfortunately, the one behind it, Laura, is going to be much stronger. Looking like the eye is going to be more to the west, but it's a big storm. What are you guys worried about? What are you expecting in southeast Louisiana and the New Orleans area with Hurricane Laura?
Yeah, kind of the things that we've been touching upon the past couple of days was, although the track was becoming more confident out towards our west, with a big system like this, we have so many examples, here in southeast Louisiana over the past couple of years, the past 15 years or so, of systems that, have taken this similar path, and we've still seen big impacts. You kind of talked about with Ross a couple of minutes ago with both Rita and with Ike. Both of those storms obviously ring a bell for us here in southeast Louisiana, because even on their approach to landfall, you still get the impacts along the coastline of the coastal flooding. We've been talking about that. And I actually came from Lafayette, my past station. So we've been talking a lot about just how susceptible Louisiana's coastline is to coastal flooding and storm surge. And it doesn't take, a thunderstorm to give us coastal flooding issues at times. And when you have a system this large, really an expansive system, you can see it on satellite right tonight. I mean, the system looking more organized, and because of that, on its approach to landfall, and also that bend kind of more towards the northwest as it approaches land, that orientation. Our biggest concern here in southeast Louisiana, we've got that storm surge warning that's flying from Morgan City to the mouth of the Mississippi River. 4 to 6 feet of storm surge is expected, and even inside Lake Pontchartrain, 2 to 4 feet of storm surge. And Ross made a great point. Waves on top of that already starting to build up along the coastline as the system begins that gradual west-northwest to northwest track towards the coast. That's the number one concern. Also, for us here, some of our coastal parishes, I really think that the tornadic threat, we had it with Rita and we had it with Ike. Some of these cells that kind of rotate those broad feeder bands late tomorrow afternoon, I think the tornadic threat is going to be possible. And then on Thursday, as the center lifts north, I think that the heavy rainfall threat for some areas. You know how when the tropical systems, they lift to the north and you still get that remnant moisture overhead. We've seen it a couple of times here. I'm still kind of mentioning the threat that we could have some of that heavy rainfall on Thursday as well.
Yeah, and this is assuming that the system stays well to your west. Scott, hang tight for a second. Let's look at one of the computer models, and then I'm going to come back to you. This is our future cast and depicting where the storm could be Wednesday night, so tomorrow night at 10 o'clock Eastern time. And you can see the eye a little more well-defined, still offshore, but the outer rain bands, Scott was just talking about those outer rain bands, those are the ones that are going to bring gusty winds, heavy rain, and maybe even a threat of tornadoes. So from 10 p.m. tomorrow, let's go to when we expect it to be making landfall, and that'll be in the early morning hours of Thursday. And unfortunately, doesn't it always seem like these storms are making landfall in the middle of the night? They can't come in the middle of the day. It'd be so much easier and less stressful. But unfortunately, the overnight hours, some of the worst weather, from heavy rain and gusty winds from west of Houston all the way back to central South Louisiana around Lafayette and Baton Rouge. So kind of cutting right across Interstate 10. This is Thursday at 4 a.m. Let's stop it at 9 a.m. So the system is inland, but still dropping mass amounts of rain. They're going to have that tornado threat, the wind gusts. This is going to cut right over either eastern Texas or southwest Louisiana. That's Beaumont, that's Lake Charles. And then through 9 a.m. Thursday up till about lunchtime, it'll continue to push into northern parts of Louisiana with some heavy rainfall there. As far as the wind goes, so that was the rain situation. When are things going to start to get hairy with the winds? Well, this is Wednesday at lunchtime. We expect tropical storm force winds, which are signified here in yellow, to reach the Louisiana coast possibly as early as tomorrow at lunchtime, and then really start to push inland through Wednesday night, here it is about ready to make landfall. Watch how it's going to go from a Category 2 to a Category 3, making landfall in the early morning hours of Thursday. The red shading here is telling us hurricane force winds of 74 miles per hour or greater. And again, that's going to cause a lot of problems with power outages and downed trees on top of the heavy rain and the storm surge that Scott and Ross have been talking about. So again, this is the wind forecast. Here we are Thursday at 4 a.m. You can see that storm very quickly starting to pick up, and by the afternoon on Thursday, things will start to calm down. So those are a couple of the different forecasts. And Scott, I want to bring you back in because, 24 hours ago, we had computer models that were putting this thing anywhere from Houston to in your backyard in New Orleans. Obviously, things have kind of condensed. I mean, it's been kind of an emotional roller coaster watching the computer models and the forecast for you guys the last 24 hours.
Yeah, no, it really has. And, it was also at times when we were doing Facebook Lives, when you had both Marco and Laura, sometimes, after saying both of them so many times, you started to get the words mixed up and you had to be like, all right, let's focus on one system first, worry about Marco, and then kind of tie that into the track with Laura. But yeah, it was, a perilous couple of days where we were just watching and waiting. How is it going to interact with Cuba and Hispaniola? Of course, the system kind of drifted a little bit further south, south of Cuba, and that ultimately has put the path further west than us. Like you mentioned, the model's really tightening up over that western Louisiana path, and even that latest European model run, bringing it right towards western Louisiana as well.
Yeah, Scott, hang with me one second. Let's talk about those computer models. I'm going to ask my director, Justin, to pop up my computer graphics behind me. But, we went from this huge, wide spread of computer models to what I'm going to show everyone now. And, Scott, so these are all the runs from this afternoon and what we're starting to get this evening. I mean, and that wide path that went for literally from here to here, I mean, now it's really started to close up. So we will watch this. Remember, when we look at computer models like this, the spaghetti plots, whatever you want to call them, we don't necessarily pick out our favorite line. Two things we look for. We look at the trends. So where have these lines been shifting over the past 24 hours? And we look at the cluster. If we've got one out here and 100 of them out here, it's probably not going to be this one. But look at the cluster of where these where they predict where the center of Hurricane Laura will be in between Houston and Lafayette. That's a pretty tight cluster. We're 24 hours out, and we will see what happens. The interesting thing is, look at how the cluster really spreads out after this system makes a right turn, and this weekend impacts the East Coast, probably with just some rain. Our two most popular models, the American model, the GFS, and the European model, I put both of those up here, just those two, and we'll compare them. What I want to show you as we go through tomorrow, so the yellow is the European, the red is the American. Look how in sync they are through tomorrow night and where this is going to make landfall. They're within probably about 50 miles of each other, 50, maybe 100, which in the whole big scheme of things is a small amount. You wouldn't want to walk that distance, but when you're talking about a major hurricane and two models are within about 50 miles of each other, that's pretty good. So Thursday, 4 a.m., either in southeast Texas or right on the state line. That's pretty good considering that sometimes these models are hundreds of miles apart. In the wintertime, sometimes these models are, 10 to 20 inches apart on snow amounts. So when we see consistency like that in two different computer models, Scott, I don't know if you agree with me, but I mean, this kind of gives a big heads up, big warning to southeast Texas and southwest Louisiana that there's a good chance, it is looking most likely that that's where that eye is going to make landfall.
Yeah, exactly right. And, I tied back to this the past couple of days was when, the models were all over the place. I was like, you got to talk about the consensus. The models were all over, but where was that center point and kind of go from there? Where was like the mean, the average of the models pointing towards? So, yeah, they've tightened up this evening, and we've been talking about it the past couple of days. For folks out towards southwestern Louisiana, a lot of them have been reaching out to us in southeastern Louisiana and saying, hey, would it be okay for us to come, further east towards Baton Rouge or towards Houma? And I put this graphic together earlier to kind of talk about some of the best places for folks in western Louisiana and eastern Texas that have been asked to evacuate, because, again, with this forecast track, the impacts, especially along that track and east of the center, are going to be pretty significant. Of course, the most significant wind impacts and the surge impacts right along southwestern Louisiana and into eastern Texas. But For the eastern side of that system, remember we call it the dirty side, right? The side that has the tornadic threat, and with landfalling major hurricanes, oftentimes the tornadic threat can be one of the biggest concerns, especially east of the center, in addition to the storm surge and the heavy rainfall, all of the factors there. But think back to Harvey. Of course, this system is booking it, but with a system like this taking this particular track, that would put a large section of southwestern Louisiana into Acadiana from Lafayette to Abbeville, New Iberia, Opelousas, underneath that threat for not only the heavy rainfall, the winds that could be over hurricane force and gusts especially, but the tornadic threat, I really think. And that's why I put this graphic together to show that even if, you're planning on evacuating towards Baton Rouge, there still could even be an isolated tornado threat there. For us here in southeastern Louisiana, I put it under the yellow threat, meaning that there is an isolated tornado threat. Winds are going to be generally 25 to 45 miles per hour higher along the coast. So you could evacuate here with minimal concerns, but if you were trying to avoid any concern at all in terms of coastal flooding or sporadic power outages, we put the green level over towards basically where Ross was talking from, over in parts of the Panhandle to South Alabama and into parts of South Mississippi as well. Folks were asking me, hey, we were trying to book a place in Bay St. Louis or Gulfport, and I said, look, as long as you're away from the coastline there, this area of South Mississippi is going to see minimal impacts, right? But, it goes without saying that if you were staying along the coast, we saw what Cristobal did earlier this year with the storm surge in South Mississippi. And yeah, that's kind of the telltale sign. Again, for our area, we've got the tropical storm warnings for the coastline, and that's why I was telling folks, hey, we could still have some of those sporadic power outages. And one more thing, Wes, that I wanted to point out, some of these areas in western Louisiana, working there for many years, these are some of the most beautiful coastal communities, really quiet places. And along Vermilion Bay, this area is so susceptible to storm surge. Even with Harvey, with Barry last year, Harvey in 2017, Barry last year, this area really right here, Vermilion Bay, south of Lafayette, these two parishes, Vermilion and Iberia Parish, if the center tonight was to take just that slightly more easterly path, I really fear that these numbers that are being put out could actually be underdone. Remember, 9 to 13, 9 to 14 feet is the official word, but in this area, in particular, from Marsh Island, Vermilion Bay, this is just so susceptible to storm surge. The orientation of this bay, when you get that funneling of water, it's really a big concern. And that's why I was encouraging everyone on Facebook Lives and on Facebook posts and on air that if you have family, friends, and relatives, in that part of southwest Louisiana, it's just so vulnerable to storm surge that there's no way that you would want to stay, even if your house, like we were talking about earlier today, some of these houses have been built up in coastal southwest Louisiana because of Rita. And after Rita, some of the guidelines said you got to be 15 feet up in a place like Holly Beach. But some places have rebuilt and they still are low-lying. So again, that's one of my biggest concerns with this system, is just for anyone out there that's watching from southwest Louisiana and they decided to stick it out and you're on the fence about it, leave, because the storm surge, I think, in some spots could end up being higher than these values are being shown.
Yeah, good advice, Scott. I lived in Lafayette for 3 or 4 years a while back, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I can't let today pass without asking you this, and I'll get you out of here on this one, Scott. 15 years ago, New Orleans and Katrina, the anniversary is this week. I'm sure that's weighing heavy on a lot of people down in southeast Louisiana as they're trying to deal with Laura. This is the anniversary of Katrina. What are everyone's thoughts 15 years later down there?
That's a question that I think a lot of folks are. There's two different camps, I would say. A lot of folks don't like talking about it, frankly. But everything here is typically before the storm and after the storm. I grew up here. I went through Katrina, went through the rebuilding process, and a lot of folks kind of want to put it behind them, but when you have a system, and it always seems like they come that last week of August, right? You can go through Andrew, through Katrina, obviously, Gustav. They all made landfall in that last week of August. So a little bit of deja vu. And I think people oftentimes with storms like this where you just don't know exactly where they're going to turn in this sense in western Louisiana and southeast Texas. But people always, I think, innately here have a little bit of fear with regards to the track of these systems. And it's just something that you're like, I just don't want to talk about it. I want this to not be a thing at all. So I think that that's a lot of people's mood, a little bit of that apprehensiveness to the situation, and also, just hoping for the best, not only for us, but for everyone, just because we know the feeling of how much of an impact it can make to the community, to a livelihood, to all those things. So, yeah, I think we know the feeling well, and I think that's kind of everybody's mood. It's just, we don't want this at all.
Yeah, can't believe it's been 15 years. Good stuff down there, Scott. That's Scott Pelier down in New Orleans. You guys be safe down there, and we will talk to you
Thanks, Wes.
Down the road. All right, one other thing before we say goodnight tonight, and that is some of the things we've talked about tonight. We did some comparison, and there are no two storms that are alike. They're all different strengths, different sizes. They come at different angles. But one of the ones we mentioned tonight, and I want to finish with this, is comparing Hurricane Rita, which hit in 2005. And, Scott was telling us about the anniversary of Katrina 15 years ago this week. They were on the K storm. Okay, fast forward 15 years to this year. We just finished up with the L and the M. 2005, the busiest hurricane season on record. They were at the K storm at this point. We have just made it through K, L, and M. We are 2 ahead of the busiest season ever in 2005, just to give you an idea of what 2020 is shaping up to be. But after Katrina came Rita. Rita, at one point, was a Cat 5. And I'm going to show you that path in a second, but here is the current conditions and forecast path for Laura, the storm that we are waiting on right now. Now I'm going to put in, here comes Rita, came through the straits between Cuba and South Florida, then exploded into a Category 5 hurricane, made a right turn, making landfall right about the Texas-Louisiana border, where 15 years later, Hurricane Laura might impact in a little more than 24 hours as a Category 3 hurricane. So some similarities, yes, but all storms are different. We will continue to keep an eye on Hurricane Laura, and we'll be back with another edition of Tracking the Tropics right here, same time, same place, tomorrow night on Wednesday night. We thank you for being here with us tonight, though. For Scott, for Ross, for Brian, for everyone involved in Tracking the Tropics, thanks for being here. I'm Wes Hohenstein, live in Raleigh. Have a great night.